Well, hello everyone, this is CJ with Cyclotron. I've been doing an extensive amount of research that forms the basis for this video. I hope that you will find it interesting and thought-provoking. If so, be sure to share it with a friend or loved one. I decided to do this video after thinking about whether most people, including me, truly understand the risks of serious injury or death from riding a motorcycle on the street.
The possibility of successfully navigating an asteroid field is approximately 3,720 to 1.
Never tell me the odds.
After doing this research, I learned that there are hardwired reasons for how the brain operates that generally makes people really bad at assessing long-term risks involving a variety of complex factors. Shockingly, the motorcycle risk turned out to be a lot greater than I had previously realized in the examples I give. It turns out that a lifetime of motorcycle riding may have a greater risk than taking a ride into space, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. I got to thinking about risk assessment for motorcycle riding for two reasons. One was the events surrounding the implosion of the Titan submersible, because it seemed that people on board knew that such diving was hazardous, but they clearly did not understand the risks associated with diving on such a sub or the probability of dying. The second thing that happened, which was also recent, was when I saw the aftermath of a crash between a motorcycle and an SUV. The side of the SUV had a large caved-in spot where the bike had impacted, and the wheel was off the bike, it was laying on the ground, and forks were jammed up against the radiator and the bike frame, and it was hard to look at. The people involved had already been transported to the hospital as I went by the wreck. Seeing that wreck was gut-wrenching for me, and I was hoping that somehow that rider would still have a good outcome. When I checked the news for motorcycle crashes in my area, instead of seeing news for that particular wreck, I saw stories for 3 recent instances of motorcycle fatalities in that same general area near my home. It involved a 16-year-old, an 18-year-old, and a 19-year-old. All of these wrecks involved a collision between a car, truck, and the motorcyclists. I have boys who are 16 and 18 years old, and they both ride street bikes, and I'm frequently second-guessing the decision my wife and I made to let them ride a motorcycle. In light of these events, I decided to try to objectively evaluate what the actual risks are relative to serious injury or death from riding a motorcycle on public roads. To get at the underlying statistics, I examined crash statistics compiled by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, who just released final numbers for 2021. I'll put a link to this data source in the description for this video. So at this point, I think we need to define a few terms. First of all, we have risk assessment, which is what I'm covering in this video, and that's the process of detecting hazards and assessing associated risks. Now let's define a hazard, which is a condition that has the potential to cause serious injury or death. So we all know that riding a motorcycle on the street is potentially hazardous. Also, getting hit in the head by a falling meteorite is also hazardous, but has a very low risk given the probability of its occurrence. In terms of motorcycle hazards, you can get hit by another vehicle, you could run off the road, you could go down on the roadway after hitting debris, or you could even have a mechanical failure like a tire blowout or a drive chain break. Now, risk is defined as an expression of possible loss in terms of probability and severity. This gets to the meat of the issue in that what is the probability and severity of loss associated with the potential hazard? In this case, we want to know what the risk is for serious injury or death while riding a motorcycle. You can combine these factors into what's called a risk assessment matrix, like this one. Probability can be frequent, likely, occasional, seldom, and unlikely. Severity can range from catastrophic to negligible. The severity of the risk is ranked from low to extremely high based on the combination of probability and severity. For the overall government figures for motorcycles in 2021, there were a total of 88,618 motorcycle crashes that resulted in a total of 82,686 injuries and 5,932 deaths. What you'll notice is that these fact sheets compile information in a lot of different ways. For example, we see the injury and fatality rate is a certain number for every 100,000 vehicle registrations, or millions of vehicle miles traveled. We see that these rates have generally gone up each year. But to know that there were 60 fatalities for every 100,000 motorcycle registrations, does that really mean much to you? Can you conceptualize that? When looking at these figures, we should remember that these involve thousands of real people that have been adversely impacted, along with the impacts to even more friends and family members. I know from your comments that many of you have been personally impacted by having a friend or family member involved with a serious motorcycle crash. Looking at the cold hard numbers, maybe we can get a better handle on the risk of a motorcycle fatality if we look at what the fatality rate is for drivers of cars and light trucks. We see that that figure is 9.47 for every 100,000 vehicle registrations. So the motorcycle fatality rate is 6 times higher than that for a car and light truck. But again, aside from showing that the risk of a motorcycle fatality is several times greater than vehicle fatalities, which most of us already know, it doesn't really give us much of a handle on the probabilities of having a serious motorcycle-related injury or death. To get at this, I decided to take the government statistics and crunch them in a spreadsheet. May have nerded out a little bit here, but I also had to make a few simplifying assumptions related to the underlying numbers. For example, if you take the government's figure for total motorcycle registrations of 9,881,444 and divide that by their figure for the total number of miles ridden in 2021, which was over 19 billion miles, you get an average of 1,988 miles ridden for every bike registered. While this seems like a low number to me, it does seem plausible given that most riders in the United States don't ride that much each year. At any rate, let's take these numbers and start to break them down into more meaningful values. Let's start by estimating the total number of motorcycle trips that a motorcyclist makes each year or season. There are many parts of the U.S. where the riding season is only about 6 months long due to winter weather. We also know that most motorcycle riders are not commuting to work and that the majority of riding is done on the weekends. Taking that all into account, I estimated an average total of 100 motorcycle trips per registration per year. That would mean that the average ride is about 20 miles long. These numbers seem pretty reasonable to me as overall averages since not all registered motorcycles are ridden. I will show you what the risks are for these numbers and how to adjust those risks for the actual amount of riding that you're likely to do. So next, let's calculate the injury rate and fatality rate for riding a motorcycle. About 93% of motorcycle crashes resulted in an injury, and 6.7% of motorcycle crashes resulted in a fatality. I can then calculate the accident rate per trip and multiply that by the injury rate and fatality rate to get the chance of injury or death per trip. Taking the government figures and my assumptions as mentioned before, I calculated the injury rate was 0.000084 per motorcycle trip, and the fatality rate is 0.000006 per motorcycle trip. Now, obviously these are very small numbers, which shows a relatively low risk per trip. Now, where things get interesting is that there's another factor which must be taken into account, and that is the frequency of exposure. That is, how many times do you ride your motorcycle each year, and whether you ride significantly shorter or greater distances than the average rider in a year. Now, each motorcycle ride is an independent event, but there is a way to calculate the risk of a given outcome over the course of a certain number of trials or exposures. An example would be the odds of not rolling a 1 on a 6-sided die on a single roll, and that would be 5, 6, or 83%. Now, if you look at the risk of not rolling a 1 during 10 rolls of the die, it would be 16%. So which bet would you rather make? In a similar way, I decided to calculate the risk of death after riding a motorcycle for 40 years. Now again, I have to make some simplifying assumptions such that the risk of a motorcycle fatality stays the same for each of those 40 years, and individual trips for that matter, which is not likely to be true. However, even with the improvements of vehicle performance and safety that's added each year, it would appear that the risks actually increase year to year given the government's figures of genuinely increasing car and motorcycle injury and fatality rates. I may be getting into the weeds a little bit here, but I wanted to be clear on how I did these calculations. I used a statistical method called the complementary probability method, which is simpler than other methods but still gives good results given the inherent assumptions that have to be made. Now, I will mention that I'm an engineer, but I'm not a safety expert and I'm not a statistician, but this seemed like a reasonable approach to better conceptualize the risks. So for the method I used to calculate the risk of a motorcycle fatality in 40 years of riding, you subtract the risk of a fatality for a given motorcycle trip from 1, which gives you the probability of not being killed on a given motorcycle trip, which is 0.9999, basically 5 nines after the decimal place. And you raise this number to the power of the number of trips over 40 years, which I've estimated to be 4,000. That is 100 trips per year for 40 years. This gives you a probability of survival of 97.7%. However, this means that the risk of a motorcycle fatality in 40 years of riding is 100 minus 97.7, which is 2.3%. To me, this is a shockingly high number. Now again, I did these calculations just to see where the government figures would lead. Obviously, the risk factors for a particular individual will vary based on a number of factors. But since I'm doing this to better conceptualize the risk, let's compare the risk of a motorcycle fatality to, say, the risk of an astronaut being killed on the space shuttle. Now, the space shuttle is no longer in service, but we can still calculate the relative risks. There were a total of 135 space shuttle missions and a total of 14 crew members killed during those missions. The average crew consisted of 7 people. So it turns out that the risk of dying on any one space shuttle trip calculates to be 1.5%, which is higher than the 2.3% risk of being killed in a lifetime of motorcycle riding based on the government crash figures. Now, as I said, these are of course generalities based on overall averages and several simplifying assumptions. So let's look at what we can do to reduce the risks associated with motorcycle riding. First of all, if we could eliminate the hazards, we could eliminate the risks, and the only way to eliminate the individual hazard for a motorcycle rider is to not ride. Outside of that, what can we do to reduce our risk while continuing to ride? Well, we have to focus on what we can control and what we can't control. Unfortunately, we don't have any control over the volume of traffic and how other people drive in traffic, which is a big part of the overall riding hazard. But we can do things like avoiding riding on congested freeways, or by not riding under the influence of drugs or alcohol, or avoid riding after dark. Avoiding such things can reduce the overall probability on our risk profile. Personally, I won't ride my motorcycle on major holidays such as New Year's Eve or a major sporting or playoff event that people in my area would be following. This is because I figure there's going to be a lot of drivers on the road that are under the influence of drugs or alcohol. There are also certain places in the US like St. Louis, Houston, Dallas, and other big cities with a combination of highly congested roadways and a lot of high-speed traffic that I simply would not ride in. My oldest son sold his motorcycle when he moved to St. Louis, and I agreed with his decision, as I'm apprehensive about driving in St. Louis in my pickup. We can also reduce the severity of impacts from a motorcycle crash by wearing full gear or not riding at excessive speeds. We can do other things to reduce our overall riding risks, such as keeping up with routine maintenance, riding with good tires that are properly inflated, and by doing pre-ride mechanical inspections of our bike. These types of measures can significantly reduce the risks associated with riding a motorcycle on the roadway, so be careful out there. There's another big area to keep in mind, and that is to not let your emotions overrule your judgment. Going back to the space shuttle example, it was a huge mistake to put a civilian on the 25th mission, which was the Challenger shuttle flight that ended in catastrophic failure. At the time, it made political sense to encourage more young people to consider a science or engineering career by putting a teacher on board. But NASA didn't seem to be bothered by calculating the associated risks of a fatality, especially a fatality with a civilian. Also, going back to the OceanGate sub disaster, I saw what was supposedly the waiver that the passengers had to sign to go on that dive. The waiver repeatedly warned of the hazards that could result in serious injury or death, but no place in this waiver was there any information on the actual safety risks. Remember that risk is the intersection of probability and severity. The probability part was left out of those OceanGate waivers, so the participants were not making a truly informed consent. Now, for those of us who choose to ride motorcycles, we have the information to better understand and manage the associated risks. One of the phenomena associated with the human brain is that it allows us to quickly adapt to a lot of situations. If we repeatedly place ourselves in a hazardous situation that has a high risk of injury or death, and we don't experience any problems, over time that situation ceases to seem dangerous to us, yet the high risk is always there. To guard against this, you should work to improve your situational awareness by being highly observant of traffic patterns and to develop good scanning and reaction strategies while riding. It would also be good to periodically refresh your training in both slow speed maneuvers and on the track. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments section on how you personally assess the risks associated with motorcycle riding in your area. Again, if you enjoyed this content, please share this video with a friend or a loved one and stay tuned for future videos. Thanks very much.